The wind howled through the mountain pass like a banshee's wail, carrying with it the bitter scent of snow and desperation. Christine Williams pressed herself against the rough bark of a towering pine, her breath coming in ragged gasps that crystallized in the frigid air. Behind her, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder before a storm. Her fingers, numb with cold, clutched the worn leather satchel that contained everything she had left in this world. The men hunting her had been relentless in their pursuit, their voices carrying across the mountain air with promises of violence that made her blood run cold. She had fled Denver 3 days ago, leaving behind the only life she had ever known, driven by shame and the cruel words of a society that had no place for a woman like her. A woman who could not bear children. Her husband had made his feelings clear in front of the entire congregation. The memory of his words still burned in her chest like acid. "What use is a wife who cannot give me sons?" he had declared. "The Lord has cursed her womb, and I will not be bound to a barren woman." The congregation had murmured their agreement, their faces turned away from her in disgust and pity. Even the women had looked upon her with superiority and fear, as if her condition might be contagious. In that moment, surrounded by people she had trusted, Christine had felt more alone than she ever thought possible. Now, crouched in the wilderness with wolves at her heels, she wondered if this was to be her end. The men pursuing her wanted her to pay for the embarrassment she had caused their friend. They spoke of teaching her a lesson, of showing her what happened to women who brought shame upon good Christian men. A branch snapped somewhere behind her, and Christine's heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, praying to a God who seemed to have abandoned her. The approaching footsteps were deliberate now, methodical, like a hunter closing in on wounded prey. "I know you're here, Christine," came a voice from the darkness, smooth and confident. "There's nowhere left to run. These mountains will kill you faster than we will. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments." The terror in her chest threatened to overwhelm her completely. But then, from somewhere above, came a sound that made both Christine and her pursuers freeze. It was low and dangerous, like the rumble of an avalanche. A voice, deep and resonant, cut through the night air with authority. "That's far enough." Christine's eyes snapped open to see a figure silhouetted against the star-filled sky, standing on a rocky outcropping 20 feet above them. Even in the darkness, she could make out the broad shoulders and confident stance of a man who feared nothing these mountains could throw at him. He held a rifle with casual ease. The men below shifted nervously, their earlier confidence evaporating. "This ain't your business, mountain man," one called out, though his voice lacked its former bravado. "Nothing in these mountains belongs to you," came the reply, steady as stone. "And the woman sure doesn't." Christine found herself holding her breath, caught between terror and desperate hope. Who was this stranger who had appeared like some guardian spirit? And why was he willing to risk his life for someone he had never met? "You don't know what you're protecting, stranger. That woman is cursed, barren as a salt flat. She's brought nothing but shame and misfortune." "Then it sounds like she's been through enough," the mountain man replied with a finality. "Time for you boys to head back where you came from." There was muttering among the men, but Christine could hear defeat in their voices. They had expected to find a helpless woman alone, not a confrontation with someone who clearly knew these mountains. After several tense minutes, she heard retreating footsteps and horses being mounted. "This isn't over, Christine Williams. You can't hide in these mountains forever." But his words were already being swallowed by the vast indifference of the wilderness. And soon there was nothing but wind and distant hoofbeats fading into the night. Christine remained pressed against the tree long after the men had gone, her body trembling with cold and shock. She couldn't believe she was still alive, that the nightmare pursuit had ended. Above her, she could hear the soft scrape of boots against stone as the mountain man made his way down, but she found herself unable to move. When he finally appeared before her, she was struck by how different he looked from the men who had been hunting her. Where they had been soft from town living, he was lean and weathered, his face carved by wind and sun. His hair was dark and longer than fashion dictated, and his eyes held depths that spoke of solitude and hard-won wisdom. He didn't speak at first, just studied her with those penetrating eyes, taking in her torn dress, her bleeding hands, the way she clutched her possessions like a shield. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentler than when addressing her pursuers. "You're hurt," he observed, and half frozen. "There's a cabin about a mile from here where you can warm up and tend to those cuts." Christine tried to speak, to thank him, but no words came. Her throat felt raw from the cold air and tears she had been holding back. Instead, she just nodded. He seemed to understand without explanation. Moving with surprising gentleness for such a large man, he helped her to her feet and steadied her when her legs threatened to give way. "Can you walk?" When she nodded, he began leading her through the trees with sure-footed confidence. The cabin was larger than Christine had expected, built from massive logs that spoke of permanence and careful craftsmanship. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light spilled from the windows. As they approached, Christine caught the scent of wood smoke and something cooking, and her stomach reminded her she hadn't eaten properly in days. The man pushed open the door and gestured for her to enter first. The interior was sparse but comfortable, with handmade furniture showing attention to detail. A fire crackled in the stone fireplace, and a pot of something heavenly hung over the flames. "Sit by the fire," he instructed gently but commandingly. "I'll get you something to eat and drink. Then we can see about those hands." Christine sank into a chair near the fireplace, feeling blessed warmth begin to penetrate her frozen limbs. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to relax slightly, though part of her remained alert for danger. She had learned not to trust easily. He moved around the cabin with efficient grace, ladling stew into a wooden bowl and pouring coffee from a pot by the fire. When he set the food before her, Christine looked up with eyes holding gratitude and wariness. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you help me?" He was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. "I've seen what men like that can do to someone they think is helpless. And I've seen what this country does to people who don't have anyone to stand with them. Seemed like you could use someone in your corner." "You don't know me," Christine said, taking a tentative sip of coffee and feeling its warmth spread through her chest. "You don't know what they said about me." "I know you're running from something that scared you enough to risk dying in these mountains," he replied, settling into a chair across from her. "And I know those men were planning to hurt you. That's enough for me." Christine studied his face, searching for judgment she had grown accustomed to seeing, but there was none, only calm acceptance that seemed foreign to her. For the first time in months, she felt something that might have been hope. "They said I was cursed," she whispered. "My husband, the whole town. They said God had made me barren as punishment, that I was worthless as a woman." He was quiet for a long time, staring into the fire. "I've known a lot of people who confuse God's will with their own convenience. And I've learned that folks who are quickest to point out other people's sins are usually trying to hide their own. But what if they're right? What if I am cursed? Then you'll figure out how to live with it," he said simply. "Same as everyone else carrying something they didn't choose. The mountains don't care if you can have children. The wind doesn't judge you for things beyond your control. Sometimes the wild places are the only honest ones left." Christine felt tears threatening, but for the first time in months, they weren't tears of shame. There was something in his matter-of-fact acceptance that touched a part of her she had thought was dead. They sat in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and distant night birds. Christine ate slowly, savoring not just the food but the simple act of being cared for without expectation. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an unreadable expression. "What will you do now?" he asked quietly. "Those men might come back, and winter's coming hard. These mountains aren't forgiving to folks who don't know their ways." Christine considered his question, realizing that for the first time since fleeing Denver, she was thinking beyond simply surviving the next few hours. "I don't know," she admitted. "I have nowhere to go, no family who would take me in." "You could stay," he said quietly. "For the winter, at least. I could use the help, and you'd be safe here. Those town men won't venture this far once the snows start." Christine stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You would do that? For someone you just met?" "You don't bring trouble," he said firmly. "Trouble followed you here, but that's not the same thing. And sometimes you know enough about a person from how they handle themselves when everything goes wrong. You didn't give up when those men were hunting you. That tells me plenty. The offer hung in the air between them like a bridge across a chasm, and Christine found herself afraid to reach for it. She had learned to be suspicious of kindness, especially from men, but there was something in his steady gaze that made her want to trust again. I couldn't pay you, she said finally. I have nothing left of value. I told you I could use the help, he replied. This place gets lonely in the winter, and there's always more work than one person can handle. Cooking, mending, helping with the animals. If you're willing to work, that's payment enough. Christine looked around the cabin, taking in details she had missed in her earlier exhaustion. It was clean, but clearly the domain of a man living alone, functional but lacking touches that made a house a home. She could see places where her skills might be useful. The animals, she asked. I've got a few horses, some chickens, a couple of goats, he explained. Nothing fancy, but they need tending, especially when the weather turns bad. And I do some trapping, which means there are pelts to process and meat to preserve. Plenty of work for someone who's not afraid to get their hands dirty. Christine looked down at her already dirty hands, marked with cuts and calluses from her desperate flight. The idea of honest work, of being useful and valued for her contributions rather than her failures, was more appealing than she could have imagined. Why are you out here, she asked, living alone in the mountains like this? He was quiet for a long moment. I was married once, he said, staring into the fire. Had a place down in the valley, tried to make a go of farming. But my wife couldn't handle the isolation, the hard winters. She went back east, said she couldn't live in such a God-forsaken place with a man who cared more about the wilderness than civilization. Christine heard the pain beneath his calm words. I'm sorry, she said softly. It was a long time ago, he replied with a slight shrug. I realized after she left that she was probably right about one thing. I do care more about this place than I ever did about trying to fit into the world down there. Up here, things make sense. You work hard, you survive. You treat the land with respect. It provides for you. Doesn't it get lonely? Sometimes, he admitted, but I'd rather be lonely in a place that's honest than surrounded by people who smile to your face and judge you behind your back. Christine understood that sentiment. The people she had thought were her friends had revealed their true nature when she had needed them most. The wilderness might be harsh, but at least its dangers were honest ones. If I stayed, she said carefully, it would just be for the winter? That would be up to you, he said. I'm not looking to trap anyone here who doesn't want to be. When spring comes, if you want to leave, I'll help you get wherever you want to go. If you want to stay longer, I can always use the help. The simple acceptance in his voice, the lack of pressure or expectation, was something Christine had never experienced. Every relationship in her life had come with conditions, but this man was offering her something different, the chance to simply be herself. I don't know much about mountain living, she said, her voice growing stronger. I've never processed pelts or tended goats. You'll learn, he said with quiet confidence. Most of it's just common sense and paying attention. And I'm a decent teacher when I need to be. Christine felt something loosening in her chest, a knot of tension that had been there so long, she had forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. For the first time since her husband's cruel pronouncement, she was being offered a place where she might belong. All right, she said, the words coming out in a rush. I'll stay for the winter. I'll work hard. I promise. Bye. Something that might have been a smile flickered across his weathered features. I don't doubt that, he said. But first, let's get those hands cleaned up and get you some proper rest. Tomorrow we can start figuring out how to make this arrangement work. He rose and returned with a basin of water and clean cloth. His touch was gentle as he cleaned the cuts on her hands, his movements efficient and practiced. Christine found herself studying his face as he worked. You've done this before, she observed. Living alone out here, you learn to patch yourself up, he replied. And I've helped a few travelers over the years who ran into trouble. Nothing as serious as what you've been through, but cuts and scrapes are common enough. Have you ever regretted it, choosing this life? He paused, considering her question. Every choice has a cost, he said finally. I gave up the possibility of having a family, of being part of a community, But I gained something too. Peace, I suppose. The knowledge that I'm living according to my own nature instead of trying to be something I'm not. And you don't miss it. The possibility of children? His hand stilled for a moment. I used to think that was what I wanted, a son to teach, to pass things on to. But I've come to realize that there are different ways to leave a mark on the world. Maybe it's helping someone who needs it, or just living with enough integrity that you don't have to be ashamed of the choices you've made. Christine felt tears prick at her eyes again, but this time they were tears of relief. Here was someone who understood that a person's value wasn't measured solely by their ability to reproduce. I've never heard anyone talk about it that way, she said softly. Most people don't want to think about it that way, he replied, finishing with her hands. It's easier to follow the path that's been laid out for you, Samarifu. But sometimes life forces you to find your own way, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity as Christine learned to navigate her new life in the mountains. The man she learned was called Dennis Martinez proved to be a patient teacher, showing her how to tend the animals, preserve meat for winter, and read the signs that warned of changing weather. Each day brought new challenges and small victories, and Christine found herself growing stronger, both physically and emotionally. The work was harder than anything she had ever done, but there was satisfaction in it that she had never experienced. When she successfully milked the goats without getting kicked, or managed to repair a damaged fence, she felt accomplishment that had nothing to do with anyone else's approval. Dennis was a man of few words, but Christine began to understand that his actions spoke volumes. He never made her feel inadequate when she struggled, never showed impatience when she needed something explained again. Instead, he would simply demonstrate once more, offer a helpful suggestion, or quietly step in to assist when she was overwhelmed. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes talking, sometimes enjoying comfortable silence. Christine learned that Dennis had been living in the mountains for nearly 8 years, that he had built the cabin with his own hands, and that he knew the wilderness better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. She also learned that despite his solitary lifestyle, he was not the hermit she had initially assumed. He had friends among other mountain dwellers, people scattered throughout the high country who looked out for one another during harsh winter months. Occasionally someone would stop by, usually a grizzled trapper or fellow homesteader, and Christine would see a different side of Dennis, more relaxed and social. These visitors always treated Christine with respect, accepting Dennis's simple introduction of her as someone helping him through the winter without asking uncomfortable questions. She began to understand that the mountain community operated by different rules, that people here were judged more by their actions and character than by adherence to social conventions. As October gave way to November and the first serious snows began to fall, Christine felt herself settling into a rhythm unlike anything she had ever experienced. The physical demands were considerable, but they were balanced by a sense of purpose and belonging she had never found before. One evening, as they sat by the fire, after a particularly challenging day, Christine found herself studying Dennis's profile in the flickering light. He was whittling something, his large hands moving with surprising delicacy. There was something peaceful about the scene that spoke of contentment. "Dennis," she said quietly, not wanting to break the spell, but needing to voice something that had been growing in her mind. He responded, not looking up from his work. "I want you to know that these past weeks have been the first time in my adult life that I've felt truly useful. Not just useful, but valued for who I am rather than what I'm supposed to be." Dennis's hands stilled, and he looked up at her with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than most people cared to reveal. "You are useful," he said simply, "and you're a good person, Christine. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." The simple statement, delivered with such quiet conviction, hit Christine harder than any elaborate speech might have. She felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. "I never thanked you properly," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for saving my life, for taking me in, for giving me a chance to prove myself." Dennis set down his whittling and looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You don't owe me anything, Christine. You've more than earned your place here. But if you really want to thank me, then stop thinking of yourself as damaged goods. You're not broken just because you can't have children." Christine stared at him, feeling something shift inside her chest. For months, she had carried the weight of her supposed failure, but looking into Dennis's eyes, seeing the genuine respect and care there, she began to wonder if perhaps the problem hadn't been with her at all. "How do you do it?" she asked. "How do you seem so at peace with yourself?" Dennis was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose it comes from learning that other people's opinions of you don't have to become your opinion of yourself," he said finally. "I spent a lot of years trying to be what other people expected me to be. It wasn't until I stopped caring about their approval that I found any real happiness." "But don't you ever feel lonely?" "Sometimes," Dennis admitted. "But I've learned there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. I'd rather be alone and at peace than surrounded by people who make me feel like I'm not enough." Christine understood that distinction. Even in her marriage, surrounded by supposed security, she had felt profoundly lonely. The constant pressure to conform had isolated her more effectively than any physical distance. "I used to think that having children was the only way I could leave something meaningful behind," she said softly. "And now?" Dennis asked gently. Christine looked around the cabin, taking in the improvements she had made, the small touches that had transformed it from a bachelor's shelter into something that felt more like a home. She thought about the animals she had learned to care for, the skills she had developed. "Now I think maybe there are other ways to matter," she said. "Other ways to make a difference, to contribute something valuable." Dennis nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That's what I've been trying to tell you," he said. "Your worth isn't tied to your ability to bear children any more than mine is tied to my ability to fit into polite society. We are who we are, and that's enough." December arrived with vengeance, bringing blizzards that lasted for days and temperatures that made venturing outside dangerous. Christine had never experienced winter on such a scale, but under Dennis's guidance, she learned to read the signs that warned of approaching storms and to prepare accordingly. The cabin became their entire world for days at a time, but rather than feeling trapped, Christine found strange comfort in the enforced intimacy. During long evenings when the wind howled outside and the fire crackled within, she and Dennis talked more than they ever had before. He told her stories of his years in the mountains, of close calls with bears and wolves, and of incredible beauty he had witnessed in the high country. In return, she found herself sharing memories of her childhood, her dreams and disappointments. "I used to love to read," she confessed one particularly cold night. "I had dreams of maybe teaching school someday, of sharing that love of learning with children. But my parents said that was foolish, that I needed to focus on finding a husband." "What kind of books did you like?" Dennis asked, genuinely interested. "Everything," Christine said with a wistful smile. "Poetry, novels, books about far-off places. I used to imagine what it would be like to travel, to see the ocean, or the great cities back east." "I've got some books," Dennis said, rising and moving to a trunk in the corner. "Not much, but enough to help pass the winter evenings." He returned with an armload of volumes, their covers worn from use but pages intact. Christine's eyes lit up as she examined them, finding classics she had loved and others she had only heard about. "I didn't know you were a reader," she said, looking up with surprise. "There's a lot about me you don't know yet," Dennis replied with a rare grin. "Just because I choose to live simply doesn't mean I don't appreciate the finer things. Sometimes the best company on a long winter night is a good book." From that evening on, reading became part of their routine. Sometimes they would read silently by the fire. Other times, Christine would read aloud, her voice filling the cabin with tales that seemed to transport them both to warmer, more civilized places. It was during one of these reading sessions that Christine first began to see Dennis differently. She was reading from a volume of poetry, her voice soft and melodious, when she looked up to find him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something in his expression that went beyond mere appreciation, something that spoke of deeper awareness of her as a woman rather than simply a companion. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibilities neither had dared acknowledge. Then Dennis looked away, clearing his throat and making some comment about banking the fire, and the spell was broken. But something had shifted, some barrier had been crossed, and Christine found herself acutely aware of his presence in ways she hadn't allowed herself to consider before. Over the following days, She began to notice things about Dennis that had escaped her attention during the busy weeks of autumn preparation. The way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the gentle strength in his hands when he helped her with difficult tasks, the quiet competence with which he handled every challenge. She found herself studying his face when he wasn't looking, memorizing the lines carved by sun and wind. More troubling still, she began to notice the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't aware. There was respect there, certainly in friendship, but underneath those safer emotions, she sensed something deeper. It was recognition of her as a desirable woman, something she had begun to think she would never see again. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. She had come to the mountains to escape the complications of relationships, to find peace in solitude and honest work. The last thing she had expected was to find herself attracted to the man who had saved her life. And yet, as winter deepened and their enforced intimacy continued, she found it increasingly difficult to ignore the growing connection between them. One evening in late December, as they sat by the fire after a particularly difficult day of digging out from a massive snowstorm, Christine found herself watching Dennis as he repaired a piece of tack damaged by the cold. His movements were sure and economical, each action purposeful. There was something deeply attractive about his competence. "Dennis," she said quietly, not entirely sure what she wanted to say but needing to break the comfortable silence. "Yes," he replied, looking up from his work. "I've been thinking about what you said, about finding peace with yourself and your choices. I think I'm beginning to understand what you meant." Dennis set down the leather and gave her his full attention. "How so?" Christine struggled to find the right words. "For so long, I defined myself by what I couldn't do, by the ways I failed to meet other people's expectations. But here, with you, I've discovered things about myself I never knew existed. I'm stronger than I thought, more capable, more resilient. I'm beginning to think that maybe the problem wasn't with me at all." "It wasn't," Dennis said firmly. "The problem was with people who could only see you in terms of what they wanted from you, not who you actually are." "And who am I?" Christine asked, the question coming out more vulnerable than she had intended. Dennis was quiet for a long moment, studying her face in the firelight. When he spoke, his voice was soft but certain. "You're a woman of courage and determination. You're kind and intelligent and stronger than you know. You're someone who doesn't give up when things get hard. You're someone worth knowing, worth caring about." The simple words, delivered with such quiet conviction, hit Christine like a physical blow. She felt tears spring to her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude and something that might have been joy. "Dennis," she whispered, not trusting her voice to carry more than his name. He rose from his chair and moved to kneel beside hers, taking her hands in his larger ones. "Christine, I need you to know something. These past months, having you here, it's changed everything for me. I thought I was content with my solitary life, but you've shown me what I was missing. Not just the help with the work, but the companionship, the conversation, the simple pleasure of sharing my days with someone who understands what this life is about." Christine's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked into his eyes, seeing there an emotion that took her breath away. It was love, she realized, or something very close to it. Not the desperate, possessive emotion she had experienced in her marriage, but something deeper and more generous. "I care about you, Christine," Dennis continued, his voice rough with emotion. "More than I should, probably, considering the circumstances that brought you here. But I can't pretend anymore that you're just someone I'm helping through a difficult time. You've become important to me in ways I didn't think were possible anymore." Christine stared at him, her mind reeling. Part of her wanted to pull away, to retreat into the safety of their established friendship rather than risk the complications that deeper feelings would bring. But a larger part of her, a part that had been dormant for so long she had forgotten it existed, responded to the warmth in his eyes with overwhelming longing. "I care about you too," she whispered, the admission feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I never expected to feel this way again. Never thought I could trust anyone enough to let them matter to me. But you've been so patient, so kind, so accepting of who I am rather than disappointed by who I'm not." Dennis's hands tightened slightly on hers, and she could see the conflict in his expression. Christine, I need you to understand something. I'm not asking you for anything you're not ready to give. I'm not expecting you to fill some role or meet some expectation. I just needed you to know how I feel, how much you've come to mean to me. The careful way he spoke, the obvious effort he was making not to pressure her, only made Christine care for him more. Here was a man who had learned to love without demanding, to give without expecting return. "What are you saying?" she asked softly, needing to hear the words clearly. Dennis took a deep breath as if gathering courage for something he had never done before. "I'm saying that if you're willing, if you think you could be happy here permanently, I'd like you to stay. Not as a hired hand or temporary arrangement, but as my partner in every sense of the word. I'm saying that I love you, Christine, and I'd be honored if you'd consider making a life with me." Christine felt her world tilt on its axis. The man who had saved her life, who had given her shelter and purpose, and shown her a new way of seeing herself, was offering her something she had never dared to hope for: unconditional love and acceptance. "But I can't give you children," she said, the old pain rising in her throat. "I can't give you heirs or carry on your family name." Dennis's expression grew fierce, and he released her hands to cup her face gently. "Then give me your heart instead," he said, his voice intense with emotion. "Give me your companionship, your strength, your laughter, your dreams. Give me the privilege of waking up beside you every morning and falling asleep knowing you are safe and happy. That's worth more than any heir, more than any social expectation." Christine felt something break open inside her chest, some last barrier of fear and self-protection crumbling in the face of his unwavering acceptance. She had spent so long believing that her inability to bear children made her worthless as a woman. But Dennis was showing her that love could exist without conditions. "Are you sure?" she asked, needing to hear his certainty one more time. "Are you sure you won't wake up one day and regret choosing a barren woman over the possibility of a family?" "Christine," Dennis said, his voice gentle but firm, "you are my family. You are the person I want to share my life with, the person I want to grow old beside. Children would be a blessing if they came, but they're not necessary for my happiness. You are." Christine felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in months, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. She looked into Dennis's eyes and saw her future reflected there, a future built on love and mutual respect rather than obligation and expectation. "Yes," she whispered, the word coming out like a prayer. "Yes, I want to stay. I want to make a life with you. I love you too, Dennis. More than I thought possible." Dennis's face lit up with a smile that transformed his usually serious expression, and he pulled her into his arms with a gentleness that spoke of reverence rather than possession. Christine melted into his embrace, feeling for the first time in her adult life that she was exactly where she belonged. They held each other for a long time, neither speaking, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they had just committed to. Outside, the wind continued its eternal song through the pines, but inside the cabin there was only warmth and love, and the promise of a future neither had dared to imagine. Spring came late to the mountains that year, but when it finally arrived, it brought with it a sense of renewal and possibility that seemed to permeate everything. Christine had never experienced the mountain spring before, and she was amazed by the transformation as the snow melted and the world came alive again. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows in brilliant colors, streams ran full with snowmelt, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with new life. She and Dennis had spent the long winter months planning their future together, and now they threw themselves into preparing for their wedding and expanding their homestead. Dennis had been right about the preacher from Pine Ridge. Reverend Benjamin Flores arrived in early May, a weathered man in his 60s who had been ministering to the scattered mountain communities for more than 20 years. Christine had been nervous about meeting him, worried that he might judge her for her unconventional circumstances. But Reverend Flores proved to be a man of surprising wisdom and compassion, more interested in the genuine love he saw between Christine and Dennis than in the social conventions they had chosen to ignore. "I've seen a lot of marriages in my time," he told them as they sat around the cabin's table discussing the ceremony. "Some that looked perfect on paper but were built on nothing but obligation and expectation. Others that might have raised eyebrows in polite society, but were founded on real love and mutual respect. I know which kind tends to last. The wedding itself was a simple affair, held in the meadow behind the cabin on a perfect June morning. The only witnesses were a handful of their mountain neighbors, people who had come to know and respect both Christine and Dennis. There were no elaborate decorations or fancy clothes, just two people who had found each other against all odds, pledging their lives to one another under the vast Montana sky. Christine wore a simple dress she had sewn herself from fabric Dennis had brought back from town. It was nothing like the elaborate gown she had worn for her first wedding, but as she stood beside Dennis and spoke her vows, she felt more beautiful and more cherished than she ever had before. "I promise to love you not for what you can give me, but for who you are," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I promise to stand beside you through whatever challenges come, to share in your joys and support you through your sorrows. I promise to build a life with you based on honesty and respect in the kind of love that asks nothing and gives everything." Dennis's vows were equally heartfelt, his deep voice rough with emotion as he spoke of the miracle of finding love when he had least expected it, of the joy Christine had brought into his solitary existence. When Reverend Flores pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was witnessed not just by their friends, but by the mountains themselves. The celebration that followed was simple but joyous, with music provided by a neighbor who played fiddle with surprising skill, and food prepared by the mountain women who had accepted Christine as one of their own. As the sun set behind the peaks and the stars began to appear, Christine found herself dancing with her new husband, feeling more content than she had ever imagined possible. "Any regrets?" Dennis asked quietly as they swayed together, his arms wrapped securely around her. "Only that it took me so long to find you," Christine replied, looking up into his eyes with all the love she felt shining in her own. "Only that I wasted so many years trying to be someone I wasn't instead of discovering who I really am." "Everything that came before brought you to me," Dennis said, brushing a strand of hair from her face with infinite tenderness. "I can't regret any of it if it led to this moment." As the evening wore on and their guests gradually departed, Christine and Dennis found themselves alone under the star-filled sky, the cabin behind them glowing with warm light, the mountains around them standing silent and protective. It was the beginning of their married life, but in many ways it felt like a continuation of something that had been building between them since that first night. As summer progressed into autumn, Christine and Dennis settled into the rhythm of married life with an ease that surprised them both. Their partnership, which had been tested during the long winter months before their wedding, deepened and strengthened as they faced the challenges of their mountain existence together. Christine had feared that marriage might change the dynamic between them, but instead she found that their formal commitment had only enhanced the love and respect they shared. The mountain community had fully accepted Christine as Dennis's wife, and she found herself taking on new roles within their scattered society. When a neighbor injured his leg in a logging accident, Christine was among the women who took turns caring for his family. When a young mother struggled with her first harsh mountain winter, Christine was there to teach her the skills she had learned from Dennis. These experiences gave Christine a sense of purpose that went beyond her relationship with her husband. She was contributing to something larger than herself, using her knowledge to help others navigate the challenges of mountain life. It was a different kind of mothering than she had once imagined, but it was no less meaningful. One crisp October morning, as Christine was working in their expanded garden, she heard the sound of approaching horses. Looking up, she saw a familiar figure riding toward the cabin, and her heart clenched with a mixture of fear and anger she hadn't felt in months. It was Ronald Morris, one of the men who had pursued her into the mountains more than a year ago. He was alone this time, and he looked older, more weathered. His horse was travel-worn, and his clothes suggested he had been riding hard for several days. Christine straightened slowly, her hand moving instinctively to the knife she now carried at her belt. She was no longer the terrified, helpless woman who had fled into the wilderness. She was stronger now, more confident, and she had no intention of allowing this man to threaten the life she had built. Dennis appeared from the direction of the barn, alerted by the sound of the approaching horse. He moved with quiet grace, positioning himself between Christine and the visitor without making it obvious. His hand rested casually on the rifle he carried, but Christine could see the tension in his shoulders. Ronald Morris reined in his horse about 20 feet from where they stood, his gaze moving between Christine and Dennis with an expression that was difficult to read. When he spoke, his voice carried none of the arrogant confidence it had held during their last encounter. "Mrs. Williams," he said, then caught himself. "Or I suppose it's Mrs. Martinez now, isn't it?" "What do you want, Morris?" Dennis asked, his voice cold and unwelcoming. Ronald shifted in his saddle, looking uncomfortable. "I came to talk to Christine if she's willing to hear me out." "I can't imagine what you could possibly have to say that I'd want to hear," Christine replied, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I know," Ronald said, dismounting but making no move to come closer. "That's part of what I came to talk about. Things have changed since then, Christine. A lot of things." Christine exchanged a glance with Dennis, seeing her own wariness reflected in his dark eyes. "What kind of things?" she asked carefully. Ronald took off his hat and ran his hand through his graying hair. "Your husband, your first husband, he's dead. Died about 3 months ago in a gambling dispute down in Colorado. But before he died, he did some talking. Told some people things that put what happened between you two in a different light." Christine felt the blood drain from her face. The news of his death should have brought some sense of closure, but instead it just stirred up old pain and confusion. "What kind of things?" Dennis asked, his voice dangerous. Ronald looked directly at Christine, his expression serious. "He admitted that the problem wasn't with you, Christine. He said he'd known for years that he was the one who couldn't have children. But it was easier to blame you than to admit his own shortcomings. He said he was sorry for what he put you through." Christine felt as if the ground had shifted beneath her feet. For more than 2 years, she had carried the burden of believing herself defective, barren, cursed by God. The pain of that belief had driven her from everything she had known, had nearly cost her life. And now this man was telling her it had all been a lie. "You're saying he knew?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "He knew it wasn't my fault, and he let everyone believe it was anyway?" "That's what he said," Ronald confirmed, his own voice heavy with what might have been shame. "He said he couldn't stand the thought of people knowing the truth about him, so he let you take the blame." Christine sank down onto a nearby stump, her legs suddenly unable to support her weight. The magnitude of the betrayal was overwhelming. She had suffered so much, had believed herself worthless for so long, all because of one man's cowardice and pride. Dennis was beside her in an instant, his hand on her shoulder, his presence a solid anchor in the storm of emotions that threatened to overwhelm her. "Christine," he said softly, "are you all right?" She looked up at him, this man who had loved her without conditions. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't know how I'm supposed to feel about this." Ronald shifted uncomfortably. "There's more," he said quietly. "After word got out about what your husband had said, people in town started talking, started remembering things differently. Most folks are pretty ashamed of how they acted, Christine. They know they wronged you." "And you?" Christine asked, looking up at him with eyes that held no forgiveness. "Are you ashamed of how you acted, of hunting me through these mountains like an animal?" Ronald's face flushed, and he looked down at the ground. "I am," he said simply. "I let my friendship with him cloud my judgment. I believed his version of events without question, and I acted in ways that were inexcusable. I came here to apologize, Christine, to tell you that you were wronged, and to ask for your forgiveness." Christine stared at him for a long moment, processing not just his words, but the larger implications of what he had told her. The foundation of pain and shame on which she had rebuilt her life was crumbling, revealing a truth that changed everything and nothing at the same time. "I appreciate you coming all this way to tell me," she said finally, her voice growing stronger. "I appreciate the apology, even if it's long overdue. But you need to understand something, Mr. Morris. The woman you wronged, the woman you hunted through these mountains, she doesn't exist anymore." She stood up, drawing strength from Dennis's presence beside her and from the knowledge of how far she had come since that terrifying night. "I'm not the same person who fled Denver in shame and terror. I've built a new life here, a better life based on truth and love and mutual respect. Learning that my first husband lied about me doesn't change who I am now." Ronald looked confused as if he had expected a different reaction. But don't you want to come back? Don't you want to reclaim your place in society now that people know the truth? Christine almost laughed at the question. Come back to what? To a society that was so quick to judge and condemn me based on one man's lies? To people who turned their backs on me when I needed them most? Why would I want that when I have something so much better here? She looked at Dennis, seeing pride and love shining in his eyes, then back at Ronald. I have a husband who loves me for who I am, not what I can give him. I have a community that values me for my contributions and character. I have work that matters and a life that has meaning. Why would I trade that for the approval of people who proved they never really cared about me in the first place? Ronald seemed taken aback by her response, as if he had expected her to be grateful for the opportunity to return to her old life. But Christine, you could have everything you lost. Your reputation, your place in society, maybe even the chance to remarry someone who could give you the family you always wanted. Christine felt Dennis stiffen beside her, and she reached out to take his hand, wanting to reassure him that no revelation about her past could shake her commitment to their future together. I already have a family, she said firmly. I have a husband who chose me knowing I couldn't give him children, who loves me not despite my supposed flaws but because of who I truly am. That's worth more than any social standing could ever prong. She paused, looking around at the mountains that had become her home, the cabin that she and Dennis had improved together, the life they had built with their own hands and hearts. You talk about having everything I lost, but you don't understand what I've gained. I've gained self-respect, genuine love, a sense of purpose that doesn't depend on other people's approval. I've learned that I'm stronger and more capable than I ever imagined. Why would I give that up to go back to a world that never really valued me? Dennis squeezed her hand, and she could feel his pride in her response, his relief that she wasn't tempted by the offer to return to her old life. It occurred to her that a year ago she might have been. A year ago she had still been so damaged by her experiences, so hungry for acceptance, that she might have seen this as an opportunity to reclaim what had been taken from her. But the woman she was now understood that what had been taken from her hadn't been worth having in the first place. The approval of people who could turn on her so quickly, the security of a marriage based on obligation rather than love, the respectability that came with conforming to expectations she could never meet. None of it compared to what she had found in the mountains. I think you should go now, Dennis said quietly, his voice carrying a finality that made it clear the conversation was over. Ronald nodded slowly, seeming to understand that his mission had failed in ways he hadn't anticipated. If you ever change your mind, he said to Christine, if you ever want to come back, people would welcome you now. They know they were wrong. I won't change my mind, Christine replied with quiet certainty. This is my home now. These are my people. I'm exactly where I belong. After Ronald had mounted his horse and ridden away, Christine and Dennis stood together in the yard, watching until he disappeared around a bend in the trail. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken thoughts and emotions. How are you feeling? Dennis asked finally, his voice gentle and concerned. Christine considered the question, taking inventory of her emotional state. Angry, she said after a moment, angry that he put me through so much pain and suffering for his own selfish reasons, but also, strangely, relieved. Relieved? To know that there was never anything wrong with me, Christine explained. To know that all the shame and self-doubt I carried was based on a lie. It doesn't change who I am now, but it does lay some old ghosts to rest. Dennis pulled her into his arms, holding her close against his chest. I'm sorry you had to go through all of that, he said softly. Don't be sorry, Christine said, looking up at him with eyes that held no trace of regret. If it hadn't happened, I never would have found you. I never would have discovered who I really am or what I'm truly capable of. In a strange way, his betrayal was the best thing that ever happened to me. Dennis smiled, that slow, warm smile that never failed to make her heart skip a beat. I love you, Christine Martinez. I love the woman you were when you came here, broken and scared but still fighting. I love the woman you've become, strong and confident and sure of her own worth. I love you too, Christine replied, meaning it more than she had ever meant anything in her life. You saved me, Dennis. Not just from those men that first night, but from a life that was slowly killing my spirit. You showed me what real love looks like, what it means to be valued for who you are rather than what you can provide. They held each other in the fading afternoon light, surrounded by the mountains that had witnessed their love story unfold. In the distance, Christine could hear the sound of their animals moving in the pasture, the everyday sounds of the life they had built together. "What do you think will happen now?" she asked. "Now that people know the truth?" Dennis shrugged. "I suppose some of them will feel guilty about how they treated you. Some might even try to make amends. But it doesn't matter, does it? We have everything we need right here." Christine nodded, understanding that he was right. The approval or disapproval of people she had left behind was irrelevant to the life she had chosen. She had found something in the mountains that she had never had in civilization: the freedom to be herself, to love and be loved without conditions, to contribute to a community that valued her for her true worth. Winter returned to the mountains with its usual fierce beauty, but this time Christine faced it with confidence rather than trepidation. She and Dennis had spent the autumn months preparing thoroughly, and their cabin was well stocked with everything they would need. More importantly, Christine now understood the rhythms of mountain life and possessed the skills necessary to not just survive, but thrive in this demanding environment. As the snow began to fall in earnest, sealing them into their mountain sanctuary for the long months ahead, Christine reflected on how different this winter felt from the last one. Then, she had been a refugee learning to navigate an alien world, dependent on Dennis's knowledge for her very survival. Now, she was a full partner in their mountain life, contributing her own skills and insights to their shared existence. The long evenings by the fire were filled with comfortable conversation, shared reading, and the quiet intimacy of two people who had learned to live together in harmony. Christine had started a journal, recording not just daily events, but her thoughts and feelings about the transformation she had undergone. Sometimes she would read passages aloud to Dennis, sharing insights about her journey from brokenness to wholeness. "Listen to this," she said one snowy evening, reading from an entry she had written earlier. "I used to think that love meant making yourself small enough to fit into someone else's vision of what you should be. I thought it meant sacrificing your own dreams to make someone else happy, even if it made you miserable. But Dennis has taught me that real love is the opposite. Real love sees who you truly are and celebrates it. Real love doesn't ask you to change. It helps you become more yourself." Dennis looked up from the leather he was working on, his eyes warm with affection. "You've taught me some things too," he said quietly. "I used to think that independence meant never needing anyone, never letting anyone close enough to matter. But you've shown me that true independence comes from being strong enough to choose vulnerability, secure enough in yourself to open your heart to someone else." Their conversations often turned to the future, to the dreams they shared and goals they wanted to pursue together. Christine had begun teaching some of the mountain children during the summer months, sharing her love of reading and learning with the next generation. She found deep satisfaction in this work, in seeing young minds light up with curiosity and wonder. "I've been thinking," she said one evening as they sat planning for the coming spring, "about maybe starting a proper school. Nothing fancy, just a place where the mountain children can come to learn reading and arithmetic and maybe a little about the wider world." Dennis smiled at the enthusiasm in her voice. "I think that's a wonderful idea. The community would support it, I'm sure. And you'd be a natural teacher." "You really think so?" Christine asked, still sometimes surprised by his unwavering confidence in her abilities. "I know so," Dennis replied firmly. "You have patience and kindness and the ability to explain things in ways people can understand. More than that, you have the kind of strength that comes from overcoming real challenges. The children would benefit from learning from someone who understands that life isn't always easy, but that it's always worth fighting for." As winter deepened and the world outside their cabin became a landscape of pristine white and crystalline beauty, Christine found herself thinking often about the concept of legacy. She and Dennis would never have biological children to carry on their names, but they were creating something valuable nonetheless. The life they had built together, the love they shared, the example they set for their community, all of these things would outlast their physical presence in the world. One particularly cold night, as the wind howled around the cabin and the fire crackled warmly in the hearth, Christine found herself studying Dennis's face in the flickering light. He was reading one of his favorite books, completely absorbed in the story, and there was something about the peaceful contentment in his expression that filled her with overwhelming gratitude. "Dennis," she said softly, not wanting to break the spell, but needing to voice what was in her heart. He responded, looking up with the slightly dazed expression of someone pulled back from a distant world. "I want you to know that I'm happy, truly, completely happy, in a way I never thought possible. When I first came here, I was running from pain and shame, looking for nothing more than a place to hide from the world. But you gave me so much more than that. You gave me a new life, a new understanding of what love can be, a new sense of my own worth and capabilities." Dennis set down his book and moved to sit beside her, taking her hands in his. "You gave me those things too," he said quietly. "Before you came, I thought I was content with my solitary existence, but I was really just hiding from the possibility of being hurt again. You showed me that love is worth the risk, that opening your heart to someone doesn't make you weak, it makes you stronger." They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the storm outside and feeling grateful for the warmth and safety of their shared sanctuary. Christine thought about all the people in the world who were searching for what she had found, who were looking for love and acceptance and a sense of belonging. "Do you think we'll ever regret not having children?" she asked, the question that still sometimes surfaced despite all the healing she had done. Dennis was quiet for a long moment, considering her question seriously. "I think there might be moments when we wonder what that would have been like," he said finally. "But regret? No, I don't think so. We've created something beautiful together, Christine. Maybe it's not the traditional family that society expects, but it's ours, and it's real, and it's built on a foundation that will last." Christine nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle into her bones. They had created a family of choice, a community of people who cared about each other. They had built a life based on mutual respect and genuine affection rather than obligation and expectation. They had found ways to nurture and care for others that didn't require biological connection. As the night wore on and they prepared for sleep, Christine felt a deep sense of completion, as if all the scattered pieces of her life had finally arranged themselves into a pattern that made sense. She had traveled a long, difficult road to reach this place of peace and contentment, but every step had been necessary. Every challenge had contributed to the woman she had become. The last thing she saw before sleep claimed her was Dennis's face in the dying firelight, peaceful and content. And she knew with absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person, living exactly the life she was meant to live. Spring arrived with its usual dramatic transformation, turning the white wilderness into a landscape of rushing streams, budding trees, and wildflowers that carpeted the meadows in brilliant colors. Christine and Dennis emerged from their winter sanctuary renewed and ready to tackle the challenges and opportunities that the new season would bring. The school Christine had dreamed of during the long winter evenings was no longer just a possibility, but a concrete plan, with several mountain families already expressing interest in sending their children to learn from the woman who had proven herself to be both knowledgeable and trustworthy. As they worked together to prepare a room in their expanded cabin for Christine's teaching endeavors, she found herself marveling at how far she had come from the broken, desperate woman who had fled into these mountains 3 years ago. That woman had believed herself worthless, had been convinced that her inability to bear children made her a failure. The woman she was now understood that worth came from character and contribution, not from biological function or social conformity. The first students arrived on a bright morning in early May, 6 children ranging in age from 7 to 14, their faces bright with curiosity and eagerness that made teaching a joy. Christine had prepared carefully for this moment, drawing on memories of her own education and her natural instincts for nurturing and guidance. As she watched the children settle into their makeshift classroom, she felt a sense of purpose and fulfillment that rivaled anything she had ever experienced. "Good morning, students," she said, her voice warm and welcoming. "My name is Mrs. Martinez, and I'm very excited to begin this learning adventure with all of you." The months that followed were among the happiest of Christine's life. Teaching came naturally to her, and she discovered that she had a gift for making learning engaging and accessible. The children responded to her patience and enthusiasm, and their progress was remarkable. More importantly, she found that in teaching them, she was also learning about herself, discovering reserves of creativity and insight she hadn't known she possessed. Dennis proved to be a valuable partner in her educational endeavors, helping to construct proper desks and benches for the classroom, sharing his knowledge of the natural world with the children, and providing the kind of steady support that allowed Christine to flourish in her new role. The mountain community embraced the school wholeheartedly, with parents expressing gratitude for the opportunity to give their children an education that would prepare them for whatever paths they might choose in life. One afternoon in late summer, as Christine was cleaning up after a particularly engaging lesson on geography, she heard the sound of an approaching horse. Looking out the window, she was surprised to see a well-dressed woman riding toward the cabin, her posture and bearing suggesting someone accustomed to comfort and authority. As the woman drew closer, Christine recognized her with a shock of mixed emotions. It was Linda Diaz, one of her former friends from Denver, someone who had turned away from her during the dark days following her husband's cruel rejection. Christine stepped outside to meet her visitor, her heart beating fast but her demeanor calm and composed. She was no longer the woman who could be intimidated by representatives of the life she had left behind. Dennis appeared from the barn, alerted by the sound of the approaching horse, and positioned himself supportively beside his wife. "Christine," Linda said as she dismounted, her voice carrying nervousness and what might have been shame. "You look wonderful. Mountain life clearly agrees with you." "Hello, Linda," Christine replied evenly. "This is quite a surprise. What brings you all the way up here?" Linda glanced around at the well-maintained homestead, the thriving garden, the obvious signs of prosperity and contentment. "I came to see you, to talk to you about what happened, about how we all failed you when you needed us most." Christine studied her former friend's face, seeing genuine remorse there, but also curiosity that suggested Linda was as much interested in satisfying her own wonder about Christine's transformation as she was in making amends. "I appreciate you making the journey," Christine said carefully, "but I'm not sure what there is to discuss. What's done is done." "But that's just it," Linda said eagerly. "It doesn't have to be done. People know the truth now, Christine. They know your husband lied about you, that you were never the problem. You could come back. You could reclaim your place in society, maybe even find a proper husband who could give you the family you always wanted." Christine felt Dennis tense beside her, and she reached out to take his hand, wanting to reassure him that no amount of social rehabilitation could tempt her away from the life they had built together. "I already have a proper husband," she said firmly, "and I already have the family I want." Linda looked confused, glancing between Christine and Dennis with obvious bewilderment. "But surely you don't mean to spend the rest of your life buried in these mountains, cut off from civilization and society. You were always so cultured, so refined. This can't be the life you really want." Christine almost laughed at the assumption underlying Linda's words, the idea that refinement and culture could only exist within the narrow confines of conventional society. "This is exactly the life I want," she said with quiet conviction. "I have work that matters, a husband who loves me unconditionally, and a community that values me for who I am rather than what I can provide. I have peace and purpose and genuine happiness. Why would I trade that for the approval of people who were so quick to abandon me?" Linda seemed taken aback by Christine's response, as if she had expected gratitude for the offer to return to respectability. "But don't you miss it? The social gatherings, the cultural events, the sense of being part of something larger than yourself?" "I am part of something larger than myself," Christine replied, gesturing toward the schoolroom where she had spent the morning nurturing young minds, toward the mountains that had sheltered and shaped her transformation, toward the husband whose love had helped her discover her true worth. "I'm part of a community that actually cares about its members, part of a marriage based on genuine love and respect, part of an educational mission that will shape the next generation of mountain children. That's more meaningful to me than any social gathering could ever be." Linda stayed for another hour, clearly struggling to understand how someone could choose the apparent isolation and hardship of mountain life over the comforts and status of civilization. But as she prepared to leave, Christine could see a grudging respect in her former friend's eyes, an acknowledgement that perhaps there were different ways to measure success and happiness. "I hope you'll be happy, Christine," Linda said as she mounted her horse. "I hope this life continues to satisfy you." "It will," Christine replied with absolute certainty, "because it's built on truth and love rather than pretense and expectation. Because it allows me to be who I really am rather than who others think I should be." After Linda had ridden away, Christine and Dennis stood together in their yard, watching the dust settle and feeling grateful for the life they had chosen. The visit had been a reminder of how far Christine had traveled out, not just geographically, but emotionally and spiritually. The woman who had once desperately sought the approval of people like Linda was gone, replaced by someone who understood that true worth came from within. "Any regrets?" Dennis asked, echoing the question he had posed on their wedding day. Christine looked around at their homestead, at the school where she was making a real difference in young lives, at the mountains that had become her sanctuary and her strength. She thought about the children who looked up to her with trust and admiration, the community that had embraced her as one of their own, the husband who had seen her true value when she couldn't see it herself. "None," she said with a smile that came from the very depths of her soul. "Not a single one. This is where I belong, Dennis. This is who I was meant to be. And I'm grateful every day for the journey that brought me here, even the painful parts, because they all led me to you and to this life we've built together." As the sun set behind the peaks, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold, Christine felt a deep sense of completion and gratitude. She had learned that a woman's worth wasn't measured by her ability to bear children, that love didn't require perfection or conformity, and that sometimes the most beautiful lives were the ones that didn't follow conventional patterns. The mountains had been harsh teachers, demanding courage and resilience and the willingness to face hard truths. But they had also been generous in their rewards, offering her a love deeper than any she had known, a sense of purpose that fulfilled her completely, and the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. She had found her true home, her authentic self, and a love that asked nothing and gave everything. It was more than enough. It was everything.